Bonsoir. And that's just about the limit of my French, plus a couple of dozen words. So I will try to speak slowly, and feel free to ask me questions later if you have any. So a little bit about myself. I have been involved in cryptographic engineering on the internet for, it's over 25 years now. So the technologies I was involved with early on were PGP, which was mentioned before, Digicash. I helped make the first internet commerce servers possible with cryptographic tools. And this was through the SSL reference implementation, which I was the co-author of, and I was co-editor of IETF TLS 1.0, which of course now is the world's dominant security standard. Because of that work, I ended up being CTO of Certicom, and in that work, I began some early smart contracts work, including various approaches to be able to have secure contracts between multiple parties. Unfortunately, the dot-com crash of the early 2000s and a number of patent issues closed that. But more recently, we now have the capability through blockchains, through the deployment of Bitcoin, through a number of patents that have expired to do some really marvelous new things. So I have taken my practice now into blockchain and decentralized identity, where I've been working in the last couple of years. In that work, I have been a board advisor to ID 2020, which was a UN conference on digital identity that was held last May. I'm hosting the Rebooting Web of Trust conferences and community, and I'm also principal architect at Blockstream, which is a blockchain technology company. So a little tiny bit about Blockstream. We believe in trustless and permissionless innovation, and these are very subtle terms. Trustless does not mean that there is no trust. Trustless means that there's no need for trust, that the design of the system has trust sort of integral to it. Similarly, permissionless is very important to all of the technologies that we're working on, because that enables a lot of our ethical and human rights objectives. In that area, we have an open source project called Elements, which enables something called sidechains. We're not going to go into that in this discussion, but if you'd like to talk with me about it further later, I'd be glad to. And also, Liquid is in implementation for capital efficiency and liquidity. But the core thing, and the reason why they're having me here, is that we believe in fairness, openness, and accountability. We want multiple markets. We want trustable security. We want us to be able to all work together to change and affect the world. So we're in this together. We're committed to collaborating, and we're open to learning to you. That being said, I'm not here to sell you anything. Blockstream has no identity product. We do have some privacy and confidential enabling cryptographic tools, but they're open source. These include things like confidential transactions, zero-knowledge proofs, crypto blinding, etc. And the reason why we are offering these and why I'm part of this community is that we want to be very careful about our uses of identity on the blockchain, because it's a two-edged sword. At best, we can hold the powerful accountable for their actions. We can make sure that things are fair, that human rights are observed, and that everybody can have an equal share in being able to participate in our future. The worst is that we weaponize identity as a tool against the powerless. We don't want to see that happen, and we need to be very careful. So we're wanting to be part of this dialogue about identity on the blockchain, because if we don't speak, some solutions may emerge that really don't meet our high standards. We really want to work together with you to make the best possible solutions. Another reason why now is GDPR. So I'm sure many of you who are in the identity or IT field know that upcoming changes in May 2018 with large fines, 4% annual turnover, which is reduced to only 2% if you had appropriate measures. Those privacy standards are on any identified or identifiable natural person. So that also includes pseudonymous information and other information you may collect that isn't necessarily quote-unquote identity, but may allow you to fingerprint or be able to identify individuals. This is a very large burden, a very large liability that all companies that are doing business on the internet or collecting information about individuals will be potentially liable for. In these requirements, some of the most difficult ones are around consent. We have to have a record of clear and affirmative consent. It has to be specific, unambiguous, and we can't have defaults. In the United States, it's like the button is always checked and you just continue on through. You can't have defaults. The consent and data has to be available to everybody who consented, and it needs to be free, correctable, and reversible. And then finally, subjects have the right to port data for themselves to a new service. So these are really grand objectives. They're going to be very difficult to do. But the same confidentiality technologies that we are beginning to use in blockchains can also be used for data privacy. Another area is United Nations. The United Nations Goal 16.9 says that everybody in the world ought to be able to have access to identity. An estimated 1.5 billion people today do not have any form of legal identity. 230 million under the age of 5. So you're seeing children crossing borders with their uncles and then basically being used for wage slavery or other human rights abuses. There are 60 million people who do not have a legal state to call on. They're either refugees or the states that they're in no longer exist. There's also some really questionable uses. So the Aadhaar card in India has registered close to 1 billion Indian citizens, but it's violated some of the best practices that we've learned in the identity community over the last decade. There are also very few laws against profiling, discrimination, abuse by law enforcement, et cetera. And then finally, something that's very concerning is, biometric abuses. They have raw fingerprint records. They're basically distributed everywhere, and you can't revoke a fingerprint. And why do we in Europe really care about this? Well, part of it is that we have some wisdom from our history. During World War II, more Jews died as a percentage of population in Holland than died in Germany. And why is that? They had a better government. They had more social services. They had better capabilities to serve their citizens, but they paid a price for it in World War II when a regime change happened. Now, I don't want to say it's just this instance in the United States. The government, against our own laws, turned over census data about Japanese Americans during World War II, and that was used for interning Japanese, which also was against human rights conventions. So we don't want to see this happen again. We want to avoid these problems. So we want to use these same tools that currently we're using to protect buyers, sellers, traders, auctioneers, but also to defend the helpless. And that's a very important part of our objectives. So I've summarized last year a lot of my different thoughts about what does this mean? How might it work? What is the architecture, hints of it, in something called self-sovereign identity. This was presented at the United Nations and was very well accepted. That's the URL, bit.ly path self-sovereign. Basic idea is that everybody in this room, in Cambodia, everywhere, is the original source of their own identity. There's this ineffable I that is here that we cannot deny. Thus, identity shouldn't be an administrative mechanism for others to control. It should start here rather than starting there and then being passed on to us. Some of the things that with self-sovereign identity are important is that nobody should be able to charge rent or be able to revoke another's identity. There's a situation right now, somebody on Facebook called somebody a Nazi. You go, oh no, that's bad, he shouldn't be calling somebody a Nazi. Well, the problem was, the guy he was calling a Nazi actually was a Nazi. And he got banned from Facebook. So his family, his social network, everybody that he's connected to, he can no longer communicate with. Those types of things, maybe minor first world problems, but these are an example of what happens when administrative control around identity is too centralized. Thus, we want every individual to be the root of their own identity and central to its administration. And what that means is a lot of things that right now we are kind of totally given centered on organizations is things like names, citizenship, licenses, other credentials. We don't want those to be fundamentally identity. Instead, they're credentials, they're verified claims that are offered by the issuers, not as declarations of whether or not I'm a human being and I deserve human rights. So it's a different twist of things. There's some subtleties here that are hard to articulate. The difference between authorization and authentication is very subtle, doesn't necessarily cross languages, and even those of us who are experts at it will often confuse them. So we've got some work to do to get there. There's some ideas about how this can be done in a web of trust-like fashion. We have a beginning of a self-sovereign identity architecture. But I think the important thing about this graph is that everybody can be an issuer, not just a government. Everybody holds identity information and can inspect others' identity information. Everybody can receive this information and evaluate it. So, and in some ways, everybody is capable of being a peer in this. So we have the web of trust, such as the diagram in the right bottom. We have a number of principles that we've begun to outline. I won't necessarily go into all of these details. A lot of them you may recognize from other places. In fact, when I look at some of the GDPR regulations, a lot of these, are directly compatible with what GDPR says. I invite you to look at the actual document. There's more detail, but currently there's 10 of these different principles. So given all of this, how do we make this happen? How do we drive this forward? How do we drive this new architecture for how to do things? So I started a little over a year ago something called Rebooting Web of Trust. It's rebooting because we'd begun to do this back in the 90s and it fell apart. And in fact, even things like TLS, which people will complain is too centralized, we have all these CAs and centralized models. In fact, it's less centralized than what the alternatives were. It's just the world has moved on and has found new ways to centralize things. So we want to do it again. But we want to do it right. We want to architect it very carefully. So we want to create the next generation of Web of Trust. And we want to be able to share it in ways such that others can begin to build on it and help us understand it, because there's a lot of challenges here. So our first design shop was last year. What we asked was a whole bunch of different experts to submit a topic paper in advance of the workshop. This isn't an academic paper. This isn't one of these big things that you spent 5 years working on. It's a 1 or 2 pager that basically says, these are the things that I care about, or things that I offer that I think the community could use, or here's some real questions that I don't know how to answer. So they presented all of those. We met for 3 days to explore all of those things. We had facilitators to help us with that. We met, we broke up into groups, we prioritized which things were the most important. What could be done? What could we do in 3 days? What can we do in 6 months? The end result was, after 3 days and some editing over the next few weeks, 5 white papers. Everything from something cool called smart signatures, which maybe only cryptographers will care about today, to how to make better decisions about reputation systems. But 2 very important ones came out of that, one of which was this use cases one. Somebody came to us to talk about all the problems that the UN and Syria has with refugees. The refugee use case basically came up. And what we were realizing as largely Western US, largely white males, we were not broad enough, diverse enough to be able to really present the right use cases for what we wanted to solve. So we wanted to tackle that in our next design shop. Similarly, we also began to define an approach that might be able to solve some of these problems called DPKI, so Decentralized Public Key Infrastructure. So it was a big success. We basically began to make plans for how to grow as a community, some of the details there. But again, an important part of this was we needed to know more about the world. And we succeeded. We ended up helping start ID 2020. This was an event in May at the United Nations where we had over 400 institutions, government organizations, and also technology organizations talking about what is the nature of digital identity in the future from a United Nations international context. So we had a lot of discussions, a lot of presentations, and some calls to action. And the day after, we basically did our second design shop. Once again, topics were submitted, ideas were shared, and we basically concentrated on those things that we could write up in proposals in 3 days, edit over the course of the month after, and the result was a number of white papers, including some more use cases. We had a gentleman from Africa who does microloans in Nairobi with Bitcoin, and what are the kind of issues that he's running into for financial inclusion. We had some people who were servicing refugees in Calais and had some very interesting observations that we didn't know about. Somebody donated these wonderful container homes for the refugees, but in order to get in, you had to use a biometric handprint. None of the refugees wanted to use that because it required them to give identity information, and their concern was that the cyber attack service of the Syrian army, which has been doing a variety of attacks throughout Europe, would use that information and potentially cause problems for their family and friends that were back home. So they didn't want this identity system, even though it would give them a warm house and a place to stay while they're in refugee status. We continued to work on these. We got a new group of people. About 30–40% of the people continued to participate. They submitted topics and advanced readings. That was the third design shop, which was held, a month ago. And David Robert and a couple of other people here were at the event. And these are the white papers that will be coming out over the course of November. Everything from more information on use cases around refugee engagement, some very interesting analysis of what is the nature of humanness and forgiveness and things of that nature in digital identity, but also some really hardcore stuff, including an actual specification for decentralized identifiers, so we can actually get to work in implementing things. Some ideas from Microsoft around identity containers. And then how do we bootstrap this stuff? This is a whole new model, whole new way of making this all work. Here's some approaches to solving those. And of course, at the very bottom, somebody basically said, to heck with it, I'm going to start writing code. And over the next 3 days, they basically put together a very viable sort of proof of concept of a reputation kit that was self-sovereign based. At the last event, it was discussed that, once again, we want to have more diversity. And diversity comes in many forms, obviously gender, race, but it's also diversity in countries of origin, in technology approaches, etc. So our goal for the next design shop was to include a lot more of that, and one of the ways to possibly increase that diversity and make for even better white papers and specifications and code was to host it someplace other than in San Francisco or in the United States. So it was proposed that we have one here in Paris next April. We want to have the same type of design shop, which is having technologists and experts work on these papers, but maybe we want to have a little hackathon, maybe some type of demo day, et cetera, in April. So some really good ideas. I really would like to do the next design shop for rebooting in April. To do this, we're going to need sponsors. It's going to be more expensive for us to be able to be out here and do some of the things we want to do, and we want to have more ambitious goals. So if you know organizations that might be able to participate in sponsoring, we would really like to have your help. You don't need to be a sponsor to participate in the community. The website, the main one that's more just general information is weboftrust.info. The GitHub is really where most of our work is done. There's also a Slack where we have conversations. These are all open to the public. You're welcome to send me an email. And of course, if you're interested in participating in the next event, you can also submit an advanced reading, 1 or 2 pages, with questions or something you think would address or solve these problems, and we will use those for the next event in April. Goal is after that to once again have the 5th Rebooting Web of Trust in late September. And that's it. Let's see. How do I get? So my Twitter is @Christopher A, and again, Christopher A at Blockstream or Christopher A at Life with Alacrity.